that to do? All right. Hi everybody. Apologies for the delay. We're just a little bit in a panic mode after the recording didn't happen last week, which of course is one day I was alone. So, but we're doing Zoom in parallel just to make sure that that it's recorded. Let me continue our discussion on on the standards of treatment and protection. Last week, we looked at the non-discrimination standards. So we started looking at standards of treatment, and we looked at the first one, non-discrimination, and we saw that just like for international trade law, it's composed of two different dimensions, MFN, or most favored nation, and national treatment. We saw the differences. We saw some of the challenges, the different formulations. In particular, when we talked about MFN, we looked at what are some of the risks and the dangers that come with this specific standard. And I told you, I think, that some consider MFN to be the most dangerous clause or standard of treatment in BITs and in investment treaties. Others think it's FET, fair and equitable treatment, which is going to be the first standard that we're going to look at today. Now, you have hopefully appreciated what are the risks and the dangers of using MFN, and we saw also how some countries have reacted to those risks. You're going to learn about FET, and then you make up your mind, and feel free to have your own opinion as to which standard is the most dangerous. As always, as long as you can bring good arguments for why that's your point of view. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the origins, very, very briefly. This is one of the first standards that we've always found in investment treaties. Even if you go back to the treaties on friendship, commerce, and navigation, you find, like in the 18th and 19th century, you find provisions that tell us that we need to treat foreigners in a fair and equitable way. And now it's become kind of a boilerplate clause that we find in almost all BITs, almost all investment chapters in FTAs, regional investment agreements, and so on and so forth. Now, this doesn't mean that all treaties have it. There are some exceptions. For example, I think that the BIT between Turkey and Albania doesn't have it. It's an exception to the rule. It's an exception to the rule, which also, though, again, shows you, and this is something that I may have mentioned a few times, this is why, partially why, I believe that there is very little of customary law in investment law, because the fact that two countries can choose not to incorporate a standard, it means that they don't feel like they have to have that standard. Now, that's where MFN comes in. You could potentially, let's imagine that you have this BIT, these two countries sat down and negotiated a BIT without FET, but there is an MFN clause. So an investor, this goes back to what we were saying at the end of our class last week, an investor could rely on the MFN clause trying to incorporate an FET standard from another treaty, right? Now, when it comes to the definition, unlike most other standards, I can't give you a definition of fair and equitable treatment, really. Nobody really can. With MFN or national treatment, I started off by telling you MFN means that you can't treat, investors from another country in a way that is less favorable. So, I gave you some sort of definition. I cannot do the same for FET. There isn't a real definition in treaties. We will find, as always, different approaches. For a long time, it was also considered by some not really as a legal standard, but more as something, that refer to extra legal concepts of equity, justice, fairness. Instead, no, it's nothing to do with, ex aequo bono, for example. This is a legal standard Some have also said that it's not really, an autonomous legal standard, but it's kind of an overarching principle that covers and encompasses a lot of other standards because there are a lot of overlaps with other standards, and it's true. You'll see that there are a lot of overlaps with non-discrimination, potentially with also full protection and security that we will see. But despite these overlaps, it's important for you to remember that this is not just an overarching concept or principle, this is a legal standard in its own right that we find in BITs, in investment treaties, and that countries have to respect. We do find different formulations. Now, you can find, usually you find the words fair and equitable treatment. Sometimes you can find just and fair, equitable and reasonable, rare, but you can find it. They are not separate concepts. So when you, for example, you have fair and equitable treatment, you don't have to analyze what is fair treatment and what is equitable treatment. It's just one standard, fair and equitable. And even if you find these different nuances in the language, the understanding is that it means the same thing. It's the same kind of treatment that is required. Now, because there is no definition, it has been interpreted, as many other things, in many different ways by tribunals. We're back to that. More than that, it has been interpreted very broadly. This is where the danger comes in. It has been given a very broad interpretation. Again, what does fair and equitable mean? I think I mentioned last week, we probably have all very different opinions, and it can be interpreted very broadly, which is what has happened. And in fact, I would say that it is probably the favorite standard for investors. They love it. Almost, I can't think of any dispute where the investor doesn't claim that there has been a violation of FET. Because you can always claim, you will see, based on how it's interpreted today, you can always claim that there has been a violation of FET. It's always invoked, and potentially everything and nothing can fall in under FET. It's just very, very broad and quite blurry. So that's where the danger lies mostly. Now, there are different formulations. I want to show you three types, three ways in which we can formulate. Can you all see the screen properly? Yeah? This is the German model BIT. So already Article 2, admission and protection of investments. I have an issue already with the title of this provision because I find it quite ambiguous in the sense that fair and equitable treatment is not about the admission of investments. It has nothing to do with the admission of investments. It also has nothing to do with the protection of investments. It's a standard of treatment. So I already find ambiguous the title that the Germans have given. But if you look at the formulation, each contracting state shall, in its territory, in every case, accord investments by investors over the other contracting state fair and equitable treatment. Period. That is all it says. Fair and equitable treatment. Nothing else. Let's look at the French model BIT. Here the title is different already. It's more precise. They call it fair and equitable treatment. Either contracting party shall extend fair and equitable treatment in accordance with the principles of international law to investments made by investors of the other contracting party on its territory. What is different here? What do you find here that we didn't have in the German model BIT? Principles of international law. So there is this reference, we'll see it's very important. A reference, so it's a treatment that has to be fair and equitable in accordance with the principles of international law. So it's a little bit more sophisticated. We have this reference to the principles of international law. If we look at NAFTA, so that was the first treaty between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, again, a different title. Here they call it minimum standard of treatment. So 3 completely different titles, right? It's the same standard, but the titles, and we'll see, this title also is going to have a lot of implications. Each party shall accord to investments of investors of another party treatment in accordance with international law, including fair and equitable treatment. This part here, we're going to look at it later. So here as well, we have a reference to international law. So 3 models, about 2 models and 1 treaty, and we have 3 very different formulations. One, it's titled Admission and Protection, Fair and Equitable Treatment, Minimum Standard of Treatment. The first one simply tells you you need to give a treatment that is fair and equitable. The French model tells you in accordance with the principles of international law, and here you have this treatment, again, in accordance with the international law, including fair and equitable treatment. So different formulations. Now, 2 of these, so the NAFTA, and I'm giving you just examples, right, as always, but both NAFTA and the French model BIT make this reference to international law. So this is an important question, which is a question that has been very much debated. What is the relationship between FET, fair and equitable treatment, and international law and customer international law? And again, this is something that emerges that we need to address because we have several treaties and several models that make this reference, that refer to a treatment that is fair and equitable in accordance with international law. Now, this language tells us basically that there is some kind of connection. There is a connection between fair and equitable treatment and some treatment that is required by international law. They tell us that the kind of treatment that we should expect of states vis-a-vis foreign investors is that kind of treatment that is required, that is expected by customary international law. Now, in customary international law, we actually have something that is called the minimum standard of treatment of foreigners under customary international law. The minimum standard of treatment of foreigners under customary international law. Now, customary international law requires states to treat foreigners in a certain way, to give them at the very least a minimum level, a minimum standard of treatment, just because they're foreigners. I'm Italian, I go to Morocco, I have to be provided by the government of Morocco a minimum standard of treatment just because I'm a foreigner, just because I'm a national of another country. Now, we're not talking about investments here, foreigners. So this exists in customary international law, this minimum standard of treatment. Now, because foreign investors are foreigners, they are a subset of foreigners, this also applies to foreign investors. So under customary international law, there is a minimum standard of treatment that has to be recognized to all foreigners, including foreign investors. Now, there is no doubt, and these formulations are a good example, there is no doubt that there is a connection, but now the real question is, what is the relationship? Is FET, is fair and equitable treatment the same? So the kind of standard of treatment that is required for foreign investors under fair and equitable treatment, is it exactly the same standard of treatment that is required under the minimum standard of treatment in customary international law for all foreigners, or is it something more? Are these two equal to identical legal notions, or is there a minimum standard of treatment that has to be guaranteed to foreigners, and then there is an additional, superior, more protective, better standard of treatment that we call fair and equitable treatment under foreign international investment law? So this is the question. There is clearly a connection, but are they the same? So is fair and equitable treatment under international investment law equal to the minimum standard of treatment under customary international law, or is the minimum standard of treatment just kind of a basis, but then you build on it? And so fair and equitable treatment, gives something more to foreign investors. So this is a question that has been posed for a long time, in particular in the case law and in the jurisprudence under NAFTA. Long time. And it makes sense that this would be especially problematic under NAFTA. We go back to Article 1105 that I showed you earlier. You have, well, first of all, you have the reference to in accordance with international law. So we have this link and we say, okay, so it's in accordance. So what does it mean? Does it mean that it's the same treatment that international law gives? And look at the title. The title is Minimum Standard of Treatment, which seems to be a direct reference to the minimum standard of treatment under customary international law. So they chose, they could choose any title they wanted for this article, and they chose exactly the name of the standard under customary law, minimum standard of treatment. So this is why this is a question that has emerged, especially in the context of NAFTA. On top of that, in 2001, the NAFTA Free Trade Commission, which is a body created by NAFTA, has issued an official interpretation of a number of provisions of NAFTA, including Article 1105. And look at what they say. They tell you Article 1105 prescribes the customary international law minimum standard of treatment of aliens as the minimum standard of treatment to be afforded to investments. The concept of fair and equitable treatment, again, let's not look at this one for now, does not require treatment in addition to or beyond that which is required by the customary international law standard. So here we have the title that says minimum standard of treatment of Article 1105. We have the reference to in accordance with international law, and we have an official interpretation by the NAFTA Free Trade Commission that tells you FET is nothing more than the minimum standard of treatment. And so we will see there are a lot of tribunals established under NAFTA that have followed exactly this approach and that have considered that when you have to interpret fair and equitable treatment, you treat it just like the minimum standard of treatment under customary international law. And then the next question is, but what is the minimum standard of treatment under customary international law? Because if we say that fair and equitable treatment equals the minimum standard of treatment, okay, great. So what does it mean concretely? So to understand what is the content of fair and equitable treatment, we are going to have to go and explore and understand and discover what is the kind of treatment that is covered by the minimum standard of treatment, because that's going to be the same, right? Because there's this equality of these two legal concepts. Now, for a long time, the content of the minimum standard of treatment was considered to be coming from good, actually, before we get to that. This is an example, the US Model BIT. You find the same also in the USMCA. The USMCA has replaced NAFTA. Similar language. This is an example of a treaty. This is a model. USMCA is an actual treaty that incorporate the official interpretation of the NAFTA Free Trade Commission. Because they have the article on the minimum standard of treatment that talks about fair and equitable treatment, and that tells you that for greater certainty, it prescribes the customary international law minimum standard, and that the concept doesn't require treatment in addition, and so on and so forth. They have copied and pasted, basically, the official interpretation, yes.
Isn't it that sometimes when for greater certainty is put inside international treaties, it's also made to make it like operate backwards for interpretation? So may it have also been done so that they can make reference to USMCA, for instance, to say also in our own treaties where maybe we didn't specify FET should be interpreted like that?
Yes, now in the case here, I mean, that's a good point. It's a way to show what that should have meant always. So potentially even in interpretation of previous treaty. Now, when it comes to NAFTA, it's true that because of all the cases that now are brought under the USMCA, for example, I mean, this is a US model BIT, but for example, all the cases that will be now brought under the USMCA were initially brought under NAFTA. And because of that official interpretation, anyway, you would have interpreted in that way. But yeah, that's the for greater certainty helps kind of clarify, so you could use it in interpreting a previous treaty as well. So when going back to the content, what is the content of the minimum standard of treatment? For a long time, it was considered to be what was, said in this case, Neer v. Mexico. This was a case which was decided in 1926 by the United States-Mexico Mixed Claim Commission or Reclamation Commission. These mixed commissions used to be, basically they were like the ancestors of arbitral tribunals. There were many. You would have, some are still alive actually, but for example, this one was between Mexico and the United States, so any national, again, it's not about investments, but any national of, for example, Mexico could complain to this commission about the behavior of the United States, and any US national could complain about the behavior of Mexico. So they were kind of the ancestors of modern arbitral tribunals. Now, this was a case that had been brought by the heirs of Mr. Neer, who was a US citizen, who found himself in Mexico, and while in Mexico, he was deprived of all his property and killed. And Mexican authorities did nothing to protect him. So here, what the mixed commission, US-Mexico commission, had to decide was to what extent the government of Mexico had violated the minimum standard of treatment that was owed to this US national under customary international law. Now here the commission proceeded, as we say, a contrario, in the sense that they didn't tell us what is the content of the minimum standard of treatment, but they told us what does it mean to violate the minimum standard of treatment. So what do you have to do to be found to be in violation of this standard? And the threshold is very high. This is what they said. In order to find the violation of the minimum standard of treatment, the state has to subject the national of another state, so the foreigner, to a treatment that amounts to an outrage, bad faith, willful neglect of duty, insufficiency of governmental action, so far short of international standards that every reasonable and impartial man would recognize the insufficiency. It's a very high threshold. To violate minimum standard of treatment, you need to show, that the state has violated this treatment, has not given this treatment to a foreigner, you need to show that the state subjected the foreigner to a treatment so horrible, so humiliating, so neglectful, that any random person, any reasonable, impartial person that is walking by the street would be able to say, yes, that's not right. That's insufficient treatment. So it's a high threshold to show that the state has actually, violated this norm. So this means that it's a high threshold to show that a state has violated fair and equitable treatment vis-a-vis investors, right? So if we consider that fair and equitable treatment equals minimum standard of treatment, and if we accept that to violate the minimum standard of treatment, you need to subject a foreigner to this horrible, humiliating, degrading treatment that anybody on the street would realize that it was so bad, that means that the same kind of behavior is required to show a violation of FET. So it would be quite hard, under this interpretation, it would be quite hard for an investor to prove that the state has violated FET. You really need to show that you were so mistreated that anyone can see that you have been mistreated, yes.
But does it matter whether or not the treatment was due because the person was a foreigner?
No. There's no discrimination, no. So a lot of jurisprudence under NAFTA has followed this. has followed this interpretation. I mean, you can show a discriminatory pattern, but even if you don't show it, if you don't show that there is a specific treatment because of the foreignness, it doesn't matter. It will still be a violation. So a lot of tribunals under NAFTA have followed this approach. And so in order to find that a state violated fair and equitable treatment under Article 1105 of NAFTA, you really had to show this very terrible treatment on the part of the state. This is an example. Waste management v. Mexico. Again, it was a U.S. company that brought this dispute against Mexico. And here it's quite interesting. So this is an example of a tribunal that has followed this. FET equals minimum standard of treatment, and minimum standard of treatment is what NIR tells us. So first of all, this paragraph is quite interesting. You have the part in red. Here it tells you, taken together, these cases suggest that the minimum standard of treatment of fair and equitable treatment is infringed when? Now, the minimum standard of treatment of fair and equitable treatment. This is not what Article 1105 says. Article 1105 doesn't talk about the minimum standard of treatment of fair and equitable treatment. The title is the minimum standard of treatment, but then it talks about a treatment in accordance with international law, including fair and equitable treatment. But this specific language is an invention of this tribunal. There is no treaty that says this. Why did the tribunal do this? To make it super explicit that FET is the minimum standard of treatment. So they came up with the minimum standard of treatment of fair and equitable treatment as if it's just one standard. So it was the way of the tribunal coming up with its own language to tell us they are the same thing, first of all. And when is it infringed? And if you read this, conveys the same spirit as the NIR decision. The conduct is arbitrary, grossly unfair, unjust, idiosyncratic, discriminatory, exposes the claimant to, it's like horrible behavior. Sectional or racial prejudice, lack of due process, an outcome that offends judicial propriety. So again, very high threshold. You need to show that it's really like a very, 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 very bad behavior on the part of the state to prove that you have a violation of fair and equitable treatment. So this is one line of case law. One line of case law under NAFTA has taken that FET means minimum standard of treatment, and that minimum standard of treatment means NIR, which means that FET means NIR. So that's one line. Then you have other tribunals under NAFTA that continue accepting the equivalence between FET and minimum standard of treatment. Again, it's hard under NAFTA not to accept this equivalence because of everything I told you, because of the title, because of the Free Trade Commission of NAFTA that gave the official interpretation, and so on and so forth. But some tribunals have said, okay, wait. We accept that fair and equitable treatment is equivalent to the minimum standard of treatment. Fine. But we can't use NIR. NIR was decided in 1926. We can't, now it's 1990, or it's 2000, or it's 2010. We can't think that the international customary law standard is still the same one that it was in 1926. Customary law evolves over time. So you have this second line of jurisprudence, once again under NAFTA, that tells you we accept the equivalence, but the kind of protection that is given to investors is higher than what is in NIR, because in the meantime, customary law has evolved. So yes, there is an equivalence, but the content of the minimum standard of treatment is no longer what NIR told us. It's more protective of foreigners now. And so you have some tribunals that go in this direction under NAFTA. So they accept the equivalence, but then they tell you that in the meantime, the content of the minimum standard of treatment, and therefore of FET, has evolved. It's no longer what it was in 1926. And so they start becoming more protective of investors anyway. And then you have a third line, which is the most, the one that you find generally now in case law, outside of NAFTA. Again, because in NAFTA, it's very hard to break this equivalence, very hard. You have the title, minimum standard of treatment, you have the official interpretation of the NAFTA Free Trade Commission, and now cases under USMCA, you have that language that I showed you in the US model. So it would be very hard for a tribunal to say that FET is different or more than the minimum standard of treatment. But outside of NAFTA, tribunals have gone nuts. They've had all sorts of interpretations. They are not tied to customary law. And so we have a lot of jurisprudence where FET has nothing to do with customary law. It's just a standard. Yes, maybe it came out of the minimum standard of treatment, but it has evolved. It has become something else. We don't look at the customary law minimum standard of treatment to interpret FET. We look at other things. And this has opened up, as you can imagine, tribunals have done whatever they wanted. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is a good example to show you a very different line of reasoning. MTDV Chile was a Malaysian investor in Chile under the Chile-Malaysia BAT, so we don't have this need to link FET and minimum standard. And here it's quite interesting. So if you start, it tells you what does fair and equitable, so it looks at the terms. Just, even-handed, unbiased, legitimate. And if you look at the footnote, it's a dictionary. It's not looking at customary law. It's actually studying the terms. Let's open a dictionary. What does it mean? And then here, let's go on with this green part. It came up with a completely different, this is not based on any minimum standard of treatment. It tells you, well, fair and equitable treatment means, because fair and equitable means even-handed and legitimate, it means to be treated in an even-handed and just manner, conducive to fostering the promotion of foreign investments. And here it's interesting, this is, again, it's another example of the importance of preambles. I'll never get tired. Preambles, very important. It tells you the object and purpose of the BIT, which you have in the preamble, talks about the desire of the parties to create favorable conditions for investments. So if the object and purpose is to create favorable conditions for investment, a country that doesn't is not treating investors fairly and equitably. And there is no real basis for this. And so he went to say, its terms are framed as proactive. So it's not about not harming, because NIR was really about not mistreating the investor. Here it's not about not mistreating. Here is about promoting, creating, stimulating. You see how the moment we get out of customary law, tribunals are free to interpret these terms however they like, and we already start being extremely protective of investors, because here a state that doesn't promote, that doesn't create, and that doesn't stimulate opportunities for investment is potentially in violation of FET. While under NAFTA, you need to mistreat an investor to be in violation of, at least for those tribunals that follow NIR. So here they looked at they forget about customary law. They looked at the ordinary meaning of the terms. Let's look at the dictionary. They looked at the preamble to give context. And it turns out to be a very protective interpretation. So this is already a good example. MTD Chile, it's a good example of what a tribunal does when they don't have to link it to any customary law standard. But then the case that you absolutely have to remember when it comes to FET, because it is the case that has set really the interpretation of most tribunals, is this one. Lots of cases against Mexico today. TechMed. Here the tribunal, again, another tribunal that came and invented language. But this tribunal, this is pure lawmaking, what this tribunal has done. And that's why I'm always like, quite shocked that, the appellate body, poor appellate body, is always blamed. And then you have these tribunals that come up with like crazy things. But this is the approach today when it comes to FET. It's this. Paragraph 154. The state has to provide to international investments treatment that does not affect the basic expectations that were taken into account by the foreign investor to make the investment. And then it goes, the foreign investor expects, the foreign investor also expects, the investor also. The moment when you invest in a country, you have expectations, basic expectations, to be treated in a certain way, that the legal framework stays in a certain way. If those expectations are not met, you could claim a violation of fair and equitable treatment. This notion of legitimate, we call them legitimate expectations, here. Legitimate expectations. This was created by TechMed. Did not exist before. TechMed came, the tribunal, and said, FET means protecting the legitimate and reasonable expectations of an investor. The investor has expectations, you need to protect those. You see the variety. You have NAFTA tribunals that follow an equivalence of FET and the minimum standard based on NIR, where you have to basically mistreat an investor to violate FET. Then you have some NAFTA tribunals that respect the equivalence, but that become a little bit more protective of investor because they believe that the content of customary laws evolved. And then you have outside of NAFTA tribunals that just go all the way to say that when the investor is coming into your territory, it has expectations, and you need to respect them. Now, not all expectations have to be respected. We'll see. It's only those expectations that we can define as legitimate and reasonable. But you see how protective of investor this has become. This is why it's considered to be dangerous. Bless you. Because it could be so broad. You are really at mercy of tribunals. How are they going to interpret? How are they going to define the expectations of the investor? What expectations is the investor going to say that they had? Now, if you pick up any textbook of investment law, you would probably see that, there is a whole evolution, the NAFTA, blah, blah, blah. Outside of NAFTA in particular, in general, and this, I'm just show you here this paragraph from the Philip Morris Award, you will find that FET has a lot of different components, and protecting and respecting the fair and equitable treatment of investors means protecting all of these things. So transparency, legitimate expectations, avoid coercion and harassment, due process, good faith. Feel free, for those of you who are interested, and this is, for example, is where you find that sometimes there is some overlap also with other standards. Now, feel free, again, if you're interested, to explore a little bit how the case law has looked at these different facets of fair and equitable treatment. I'm going to focus only on legitimate expectations, so I won't expect you to know much about any of the other components. Just know that It's not just about the legitimate expectation. You can also, again, there is a big violation of due process. You can claim a violation of fair and equitable treatment. So it's not just about the legitimate expectations. But legitimate expectations are often raised because it's quite easy to say that you had expectations and they have not been met. So this is just for you to know that there are several components. And again, if you ever, pick up a textbook in the future or in any moment, you might find a lot of, case law and other components, but I will only look at this. So I don't expect you to come and tell me everything about good faith or harassment. I want to tell you more about legitimate expectations because this is really where the most interesting jurisprudence and the more controversial one is. So we call them legitimate expectations. They were created by TechMed, so they're an invention of a tribunal. That's why I said this is lawmaking. They came up with this, and now tribunals are running with it. Expectations have to be legitimate and reasonable. This is not about protecting the investor's hopes and dreams. I was hoping, to get rich in your country. No. It's not about, well, of course, that the issue with expectations is that as all standards, this is supposed to be an objective standard, right? That the tribunal should be able to assess objectively. But you introduce this idea of expectations. Expectations are necessarily subjective. So we are introducing some level of subjectivity in a standard that should be objective. Investors are going to have different expectations. They won't have the same expectations. Depending on the sector, depending on the country where they invest, their expectations will change. So we are adding this layer of subjectivity which complicates things for tribunals. Now, tribunals have come up with some, I don't want to say, some elements that I want to take into account. Again, not all expectations should be protected. Only those that are legitimate and reasonable. Now, legitimate, they need to derive from objective facts. There is a certain regulation that is adopted that says that the corporate tax is 5%. Okay, that's a fact. I can have the expectation that this is going to be my corporate tax for the next 8 years, which is the length of my investment. So they have to come from objective facts. I need to have expectations that you can assess what did I base my expectation on. It has to be objective representations of the states. So for instance, a law, a regulation, I'm considering investing somewhere, and I go and I'm in touch with government officials, and then they invite me to a fancy dinner. I go. The government official I've been dealing with gets very drunk and tells me, "Don't worry, you won't have to pay taxes." Okay, I don't have a legitimate expectation based on a drunken government official. Or I go to the office with a briefcase full of cash. I leave it. I'm like, I understand there is a 5% corporate tax, but I'm sure we can find a solution where I pay nothing. And then I slowly leave. Okay, I can't get an expectation out of bribery. So these are based on real cases. So it's obvious to you, not obvious to some investors. Or maybe obvious, but, convenient. So, it has to be from objective representations and facts. They also have to be reasonable. And so, again, I can't, and we'll talk more about this, I can't expect nothing to ever change. Regulatory change is part of the life of a state. So something at some point might change. There could be inflation, there could be lots of things that might require little changes. As an investor, I also need to be responsible. I need to do my due diligence. She's not here now. I have a student that is taking also this course who did her master thesis with me, who wrote a beautiful thesis on the due diligence of investors. So you need to balance the expectation with the due diligence. So I'm investing in a country, I need to know if there is a law that is being discussed in parliament, that they're gonna maybe adopt it. that is going to change something for me. I need to know if the sector is highly regulated or not. I need to know, I mean, if I'm investing in a country where the government changes every year, I need to be aware. I can then complain the government is changing. So there is also a level of responsibility that is put on the investor to study the market, the environment. So you can't just fall, out of the moon and say, oh, I didn't know anything. No, you should be a responsible investor. So that's also important. The moment is also important of when the expectations originate. They originate at the moment of the investment. If things improve later on, that doesn't create new improved expectations, right? So I want to invest. I know that at the moment where I'm deciding to invest, the corporate tax is 5%. After 2 years that I'm already investing, they lower it to 2%. If after a while they bring it back to 5%, I can claim that I had the legitimate expectation that it would stay at 2% or that it would keep decreasing every 2 years. What counts, what matters, is the situation that was there when I invested. And improvements that happen afterwards, it's, great. Put it on a win column and move on, but you can claim that created new expectations. And then important, which goes back to this idea of the reasonable expectations, you can't expect the legal framework never to change. So what is also important is that, again, change is part of the life of a legal system. And states, we can't tell states, don't ever change anything, because you have this bunch of investors that have relied on a certain framework that was existent at a certain point in time. So of course states should be free to regulate, in the public interest, national security, for health. Imagine that you have a financial crisis, you need to be able to deal with that. There is a global pandemic, you need to be able to regulate. Climate change, lots of reasons why a state might want to regulate. So there has to be a balance between the two. And there is a case, very interesting case, that has said this very beautifully, which is this one, Saluka, Czech Republic. This is a kind of paragraph I might enjoy giving as an exam. This, by the way, it's also interesting for those of you who were interested in the whole discussion on corporate investor and the nationality of investors. This is an example. This is under the Netherlands, Czech Republic. The investor is a Dutch company, but it's actually controlled by Japanese people, but it's headquartered and registered in the Netherlands. So no tribunal pierced the corporate veil, so Dutch company. No investor may reasonably expect that the circumstances prevailing at the time the investment is made remain totally unchanged. So that cannot be a legitimate or a reasonable expectation. So you can complain about any little change. Some change will be there. It's part of life. The determination of a breach requires a weighing. It's a balancing exercise. On the one hand, you have the legitimate and reasonable expectations of the investor, and on the other, you have the regulatory right of the state. So it boils down to this exercise. Most of the jurisprudence outside of NAFTA and USMCA in the future, this is what it is about. It's about protecting the legitimate expectations, reasonable expectations of investors. So it is quite highly protective, but with some caveats, with some limits, which is what I've told you. And at the end of the day, if you pick any case where they discuss the FET and legitimate expectation, the tribunal is somehow required to do this balancing. What are the changes that the country made? Okay. How do they, weigh in comparison with the reasonable and legitimate expectation of the investor? And again, every time you have three different arbitrators that decide this. They will do this exercise very differently. There's very little predictability as to what a decision will look like. That's why this is a tricky standard. Investors try it because you might be able to get something out of FET. States don't love it because there's just no predictability as to how the tribunal is going to weigh, their own regulatory interest and the reasonable and legitimate expectations of the investor. Everything clear?
Why would they, if they don't like it, why would they even create this with this clause?
Well, but first of all, it's two things. First, these are reciprocal treaties, right? So that's a little bit, one of you had a very good question at the end of last class, same question as to why they don't want MFN. Because on the one hand, when you are the host state, it's kind of annoying. But when you're investors, then you want it. So there is this tension. And that's where who are the parties to the treaty, the capital exporting, capital importing. In the end, those that have to gain from a lot of protection are the capital exporting countries that usually are those that impose a little bit or guide the trajectory. So that's why we have all these big protections. And then the other thing is something that actually we see a lot in a lot of treaties. Sometimes, this is a good example. I don't think any country that ever, at least until TechMed was 2003, the decision that concluded BITs had this in mind. This is why this is lawmaking. They never would have thought that this is how it would have been interpreted. So this happens, and again, I was having this very similar conversation somewhere in another class or somewhere else about the Paris Agreement. You put some provisions, great, you need to find a compromise, or they become boilerplate. Never in your wildest dreams you would think that they would be 20 years later be interpreted in an entirely different way. So there's that. And that's why then you have new provisions that carve out, add things, because you're like, oh my God, I created this kind of Frankenstein that now is out of the bag, and I have to control it. That's a very good point. Anything else on FET? More or less clear? All right, let's take a break. Let's take 15 minutes. We come back at 3:28, and we continue with full protection and security. It's everything now, these two standards, much easier than FET. All right. Let's get back. So the last two standards, and then which are the standards of protection, and then we are done with the substantive protection of investors. And now, while for trade I had to be extremely selective, so we talked about a few provisions in WTO law which are literally the tip of the iceberg. Just for you, if any of you is interested in deepening your knowledge in WTO law, know that there is 1,000 times more to discover. Instead, for investment law, this is it. This is it. There are a few extremely vague and broad standards for arbitrators to play with. Don't quote me on this. All right, so standards of protection, which really, it's not so much about how to treat investors, but it's really how to, the duty to protect them from different things. Full protection and security, there are a few, I think, important things to say about the standard. The first one is that there are two different approaches in terms of the relationship between full protection and security and FET. You will find some tribunals that put them in the same basket. They treat them together, and they think that the interpretation and the jurisprudence, for example, of FET can be used to interpret full protection and security. And then you have those tribunals that treat them very separate as two entirely different standards. Now, I belong to those that think that these should be two different standards. Very simply, from a logical point of view, they exist, both of them. So why having two standards if we need to treat them as one? And again, one is the standard of treatment, and it really tells us how to treat investors, and this one is about protecting from certain harm. But the reason why so just for you to know that you may have these two different lines, the reason why some tribunals have been treating them almost as if they are the same thing is because some treaties put them together. And we saw a few of them. The US Model BIT, for example, Article 5, minimum standard of treatment, it tells you basically that the minimum standard of treatment is about fair and equitable treatment and protection and security. They put them together in the same provision, one after the other. So a lot of tribunals, when the treaty looks like this, they consider them to be basically two dimensions, for example, of minimum standard of treatment. So two sides of the same coin, and they treat them in the same way. By the way, small parenthesis, just very quickly, one of your classmates asked me a very good question, and I want to clarify something for everyone. Going back to FET just for a second. Under NAFTA, we said that because of the title of Article 1105, because of the language, and because of the official interpretation of the NAFTA Free Trade Commission, it's almost impossible for tribunals to get out of the equivalence between FET and minimum standard of treatment. Your classmate rightly pointed out, but what about the French model, for example? The French model that I showed you also makes a reference to international law. So when you have a treaty like that outside of NAFTA, then you have a whole world of possibilities. You can have a tribunal that, because there is a reference to in accordance with international law, decides that there is an equivalence, but you can also have a tribunal that doesn't feel like they're tied to this and they go with legitimate expectations and whatever. So just this gives you a sense even of how diverse the jurisprudence can be. Full protection and security. So this is the first point to keep in mind. You will have some treaties that put them together, and so tribunals that put them together, and then you have some treaties that treat them separately in different provisions, and tribunals that treat them separately. First thing to remember. The second is, what kind of protection is it, and what is the content exactly of this full protection and security? What does it mean? Now, some tribunals treat full protection and security simply as the protection of physical security of investments. This is, for example, this is the line that I tend to agree with. Again, always feel free to disregard. There's lots of tribunals that disagree with me. I do think that, and again, I agree with all the tribunals that have limited full protection and security to the protection of the physical security of investments. So protecting investments and investors from physical harm. That's it. This is a good case, AAPL Sri Lanka. So this is a case where the Sri Lankan army, so the state army, was chasing some rebels. And by chasing some rebels, they ended up inside the building owned by the investor, where basically the investor was operating, and they destroyed it while chasing the rebels. And so here the tribunal found that the state had failed to protect the physical safety and security, because that was the state army that didn't care, they destroyed it, and they didn't protect the physical integrity of the investment. So that's one way, is to just look at the full protection and security as protecting the investor, the investment from physical harm, from often is destruction of property. This is another case, Saluka, we're back to our friend Saluka. And this also shows you that quite often, in a case, the investor is gonna raise a few standards. They're gonna say this violates FET because, it also violates full protection and security because, it also maybe is an expropriation and so on and so forth. So you might find that the investor is trying to cover all its bases, so it's raising multiple claims. So here there was also a claim under full protection and security, and here the tribunal was very clear to say that it's only about physical security. It's only when the foreign investment has been affected by civil strife and physical violence. And you continue with the blue here. The full security and protection clause is not meant to cover just any kind of impairment of an investor's investment, but to protect more specifically the physical integrity of an investment against interference by use of force. So here the tribunal followed the same line and said it's only against physical security. It's not any kind of security. And the reason why the Saluka tribunal was so explicit is because in the meantime there had been lots of tribunals instead that had said that, and I will show you an example later, that it's not just about physical security, it's also legal security, which basically means FET, like the stability of the legal framework and so on and so forth. And so the Saluka was very clear, it's like, no, we need to put a stop to this line of jurisprudence. We need to make it very clear that those are two different things. This is just about physical security. And then in yellow you have, it tells you what is required of a state. What kind of duty is it to protect the physical security of an investment? And it tells you it's a duty of due diligence. Now I know some of you have taken international environmental law with me. So for those of you that have taken this course or some other course where you studied due diligence, what kind of obligation is it? The duty of due diligence. What type of obligation is it? It was a very popular question at the exam. I see you up there. Is it an obligation of sorry.
Is it preventive, so not after the act has been committed and the violation, but before?
Preventive, very good, but there's also something else.
It's an obligation of means, if I remember correctly.
Very good. Obligation of means or conduct, not of result. You need to do everything in your power to avoid a certain situation, to prevent. So it's good, preventive, and so it's not, as it says, it's not strict liability. It's not that because even if you did your best, a physical harm was caused, you're not responsible. You need to just show that you have done everything you could. Obligation of vigilance, shall take all measures necessary to ensure. But it's not, as it calls it here, strict liability. Remember, for any course you're going to have in international law, whenever an obligation is an obligation of due diligence, it's always an obligation of conduct or means. It requires a certain conduct, not a certain result. And the idea is that it will be too much on states. So So as I said, the reason why the San Luca Tribunal was so clear here, by the way, as any obligation of due diligence, it's also not the same depending on the state. You can't expect all states to exercise the same level of due diligence. So the reason why the San Luca Tribunal was so, clear is precisely because we have other tribunals that instead have told us that protection of full protection and security is not just about physical security. And this is a case, for example, Zurich v. Argentina, Siemens v. Argentina is another good case. These are all cases where the tribunals have instead said it's not just about physical, it's more. And again, I don't agree with this line of reasoning, but this is actually, it's a nice case if you want to instead argue that it should be both. This is a nice case to use. So first of all, again, you have the treaty, Argentina-US BIT puts fair and equitable treatment and full protection and security together in the same provision. So that's already helpful for the tribunal to say there is an interrelationship between fair and equitable treatment and full protection and security. Then it tells you the cases referred to above, you don't have them, but it's only two, as if this is the normal jurisprudence, 2 cases. Show that full protection and security was understood to go beyond protection and security ensured by the police. So they cite 2 other cases where the tribunals found that it was not just about physical protection. And it tells you it's not only a matter of physical security. The stability afforded by a secure investment environment. This is FET. A legal framework that is stable, predictable. And then it tells you, the term protection and security are qualified by full. It says full protection and security. It doesn't use any other adjective. It doesn't say physical, it says full. So why should we limit ourselves to physical security? It's full, 360 degrees. And so, it uses this, because it failed to provide fair and equitable treatment, it also breached full protection and security. Because basically it interprets them in the same way. And again, you could tell me, it's true, the language, it says full. If they wanted to only mean physical, that's an argument that you could make. If they wanted to make physical, they could have said physical. Why did they write full? Why did they put it together with FET? But then, what's the point of having full protection and security? Why didn't they stop at FET? But you have both, you'll find tribunals that go in both directions. Everything clear? It's not a super exciting standard. It's not a super exciting standard for protection and security, but the most interesting debate is this one, the relationship with FET. Is it the same or is it just physical security, so is it something limited? Now, this is an example of the EU and Canada that decided to avoid interpretations like Zurich's Argentina. So you have states. Again, sometimes the response of states is to try and clarify things in the treaty itself. So you have Article 810, where here it tells you very clearly that full protection and security only refers to obligations relating to the physical security. So this is a reaction of those countries that want to kind of limit the scope of full protection and security, want to avoid having tribunals creating an equivalence between FET and full protection and security. And so they make it very clear. A tribunal could not argue with an article like this that full protection and security goes beyond physical security. So you see a pattern, right? You see a pattern that this is whenever tribunals start going in 1,000 different directions, of course we can try to, through interpretation, or we can try to think of how to reform investment arbitration. We'll talk about it next week to streamline decisions, but in the meantime, states are dealing with it this way by introducing clarifications to try and limit the freedom of tribunals. And then in the last 15 minutes we have, I'll talk to you a little bit about the last standard of protection, which is the protection against expropriation. Now, I don't know how much you remember our first session, probably. I think probably not much. But expropriation, first of all, is a right. States have the right to expropriate. Now, remember, I showed you, I think I showed you, I'm mixing up some classes sometimes, but I think I showed you the UN General Assembly Resolution 1803 from 1962 on permanent sovereignty over natural resources, when talking about, you know, the battle of newly independent states for a new international economic order. This resolution establishes the principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which is customary law, and it also states that states have the right to expropriate and nationalize. But there are some limits. They have to do it for public purpose. They have to compensate. But the right to expropriate is a right of the state. It's a customary law right of the state. And I'm stressing this because you will see that all the provisions on expropriations are phrased in a way that make it look like it's not a right, but it is. But there are some limits and some conditions. So international investment law has evolved in a way that, yes, there is a right to expropriate, but expropriation is lawful only under certain conditions. Different formulations that you see, it's always formulated in a negative way. Investments may not be expropriated, so it looks like it's not a right, but actually there is a right to expropriate, but they're always formulated in this negative way. So this is the German model BIT. Investments may not, we will look at directly and indirectly later, may not be expropriated, nationalized, except for the public benefit and against compensation. So two conditions here. The public benefit or a public purpose, you can find different language. So there has to be a public interest, public purpose why you're expropriating, and against compensation. Two conditions. Have a look at the UK model BIT. What conditions do you see here? Anything different? Anything more?
There's also the non-discrimination.
There's also non-discrimination. So third condition, it cannot be done in a discriminatory manner. There is also something else that is a little different.
There is
Prompt, adequate, and effective. This was, again, back in the 1930s, when there was that whole Mexico-US issue with the agricultural reform in Mexico. They had expropriated a lot of American farmers. Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, wrote a letter, this was 1938, to the Mexican Minister of Foreign Affairs saying, you need to give prompt, adequate, and effective compensation. We don't know where he came up with these three adjectives, but many years later, we find them in the UK model BAT, and even today, even if the treaty doesn't say prompt, adequate, and effective, any tribunal will look at whether compensation was prompt, adequate, and effective. So the Hull formula from 1938 has become now standard practice. Perfect. So you have the public purpose, you have non-discrimination, and prompt and adequate and effective compensation. Let's look at the Canadian model BIT. Well, this even has like little numbers. What is different here? Due process of law. In accordance with due process of law. So there are different formulations. Regardless, honestly, regardless of the formulation, even if an arbitral tribunal is looking at this, is still gonna look at all 4 conditions that you see here. It's now generally considered that to be lawful, an expropriation has to do these 4 things. It has to be for the public purpose. Here, usually tribunals don't get too much into this. It's up to the state to determine what is their own public purpose, unless it's obviously clear that there's nothing, that there's no reason. But it's never really an issue. Most cases, there is some form of public purpose. In a non-discriminatory manner, this is also not particularly exciting in disputes. You need to really show that there is a pattern of discrimination. But it's quite rare that you find that. A lot of case law, the issue is with the due process of law. Meaning, you're expropriating me. It's not accordance to due process if you don't inform me, if you don't give me access to administrative or judicial mechanisms, if my assets are frozen, if I'm imprisoned, if I'm humiliated. So if anything that has to do with due process is not respected, there are lots of cases like this, where the person is not put in the position of defend themselves or find solutions, is not informed, and so on and so forth. And then you need to pay compensation. And compensation has to be prompt, adequate, and effective. Now, prompt, it has to be quick. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to pay immediately, but there has to be a timeline agreed upon, Not that I will pay you in 25 years. It has to be adequate. Usually it's the fair market value of the investment before the expropriation is announced, because after the value. And usually you have all sorts of rules about how you determine the adequate compensation. Usually in arbitration you have experts coming in that make all those calculations. And it has to be effective, meaning that it has to be in convertible currency, I think we say, right? Today is rare that you have issues of this kind, but we had times where, for example, the currency of Zimbabwe was not convertible. Now they had this currency that each was like $10,000, but actually was 0.05 cents or something, the real value. Yes.
So does that mean that cryptocurrency?
Yeah, that's a whole issue. Yeah. So that's, ideally no. But that's actually, it's quite, I would love to have somebody that writes a thesis on that, just so you know.
Because if I'm not mistaken, I think El Salvador is probably the only country in the world that accepts cryptocurrency as an official currency. So if they expropriate some territory in their own land, and because for them it's
and they give, that's a very interesting point. I can't answer you. I can give you a straight answer, but this is. It could potentially be, I guess, in certain situations. Maybe in a situation like this, it could make sense if it has a value that it's that you can convert it in something else. But it is a very interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah.
Is it possible to pay that not with a currency but probably security, probably bonds for their own country?
It has no. Not really. It has to be liquidity, yeah. But I'm gonna look at the cryptocurrency. That's I've been thinking about it for a while actually. Venezuela had this issue, Argentina with the peso. So there are quite a lot of countries that had moments where it was not convertible. Now, one important difference, and this is the last thing that I'm gonna talk to you about, is the difference between direct and indirect expropriation. Very important. You have this in any provision. Usually tells you that investments by an investor may not directly or indirectly be expropriated, nationalized, or subjected to any other measure the effects of which would be tantamount to expropriation. So there's already a difference between expropriation and nationalization, right? Nationalization, you're taking over as a government the whole sector. Nationalization of the oil industry in many countries at some point, the government takes over the oil sector. So if there are a bunch of private actors, you're gone, mine. Expropriation is not because the government wants to do what you're doing, but it's because the government needs, for example, that, and talking about direct expropriation, but it needs that plot of land. I want to build a highway. Your factory is exactly where I want to build my highway. I'm going to expropriate you so that I can build my highway. I can demolish your property. Now, these are examples of direct expropriation. When I take your property and you don't have it anymore. As an investor, you lose your assets, your physical assets. I build a highway, I take away your factory, I destroy it, and I build my highway. You don't have your asset, your investment. But it also covers measures, the effects of which would be tantamount to expropriation. This is what we call indirect expropriation or regulatory expropriation. Well, the government introduces certain measures that you as an investor, you keep your property, you keep your assets, but you cannot do anything with them anymore. The effect is basically the same. They lose the value. I introduce a tax so high that you can't pay it, you can't operate anymore. Extreme case. It's today direct expropriations, very rare. Indirect expropriations mostly happening, and in particular a type that we call creeping expropriations, which is not one measure, it's many measures. Each individual is fine, but one after the other. First I introduce a higher tax, then I introduce that you need to get 5 licenses. That is very hard to get. Then a requirement, you need to update all your technologies. And all of these different measures, one after the other, I mean, one is fine, but all of them together, at the end of the day, you can't operate your investment anymore. This is an example. The Canadian Model BAT is quite useful because it gives you a definition. Usually you do not find definitions of what a direct and an indirect expropriation are. This is one case where you have it. Now, the big question when it comes to indirect expropriation is the following. So you are in a situation where you have all these different measures that can be qualified as indirect expropriation, right? So for it to be lawful, you need to do all of these things in the public interest, due process, no discrimination, and you need to pay, right? But what if, imagine that you want to do something for climate change mitigation, and you introduce licensing and standards and taxes for climate change purposes. Doesn't mean that you need to compensate whoever might be affected by this, because this is a case of indirect expropriation. And to be lawful, you need to pay off all these investors. Or is this just a state exercising regulatory sovereignty? Where is the line? How do you even know who are all the investors affected if you introduce a new tax? Some tribunals have only looked at the effect of the measures. This is the sole effect doctrine. That's how we call it. They only look at the effect. Is the effect of these measures tantamount to expropriation? Yes, it's an indirect expropriation, regardless of why you did it. Even if it was because there was a pandemic, because you were in a financial crisis, because you're protecting the climate, we don't care. What is the effect? Is it the same as an expropriation, meaning the investor cannot operate anymore? It's an indirect expropriation. You need to pay to be lawful. And if it's not, you need to pay. And then you have tribunals that follow what we call the police powers doctrine. The police powers doctrine, where instead they look at the rationale. Why did you do that? Was it because you were fighting a pandemic, or you were dealing with a difficult financial crisis, and so on and so forth, and then it's a regulatory exercise of your, it's a legitimate exercise of your regulatory powers. It does not qualify as an indirect expropriation. Very difficult assessment. Very